general store door swung shut behind her, and the cold hit like a wall. Wynn pressed her back against the clapboard, siding, and shut her eyes. The wind off the ridge came in long, low pulls, the kind that didn't howl so much as groan, like something old and tired moving through the pines. Her coat, if you could still call it that, had lost 2 buttons since October, and the lining had pulled away from the left shoulder. She held it closed with one fist. Inside, Mr. Deakins had said the words quietly, like he was apologizing for the weather. "The tab's run too long, Miss Wynn. I can't carry it further. I'm sorry." She hadn't argued. There was nothing to argue. He was right. The tab had run too long. She had 43 cents in her coat pocket and a pair of boots that leaked through the left toe when she walked through slush. The road back to the boarding house was half a mile, and she already knew what Mrs. Harwick would say when she got there. She'd said it twice this week. A third time would come with her trunk sitting on the porch. Wynn opened her eyes. The sky above the mountains was the color of a tin cup, gray and dull and indifferent. Snow had been falling since morning, not the soft kind that settled pretty on fence posts, but the hard, dry kind that stung your cheeks and collected in the creases of your collar. The street was nearly empty. A wagon sat outside the feed merchant, the horse standing with its head low, steam rising off its back. 2 men talking under the overhang of the hardware store stopped and looked at her, then looked away. She started walking. The boarding house was east, past the livery and the church, and the stand of spruce that marked the edge of town. She knew every step of it, had walked it every day for 11 months, ever since she'd come up from Kamloops, with nothing but her trunk and the belief that things would settle into place, if she gave them enough time. They had not settled. They had come undone slowly, and then all at once, the way ice does in March. Her employer, a man named Croft, who ran a small land survey office on the main road, had let her go 6 weeks ago. Cutbacks, he'd said, though she'd noticed he'd hired a younger girl the following Monday. She'd said nothing then either. She was getting good at that, at saying nothing. She was almost to the livery when the wagon pulled up beside her. She didn't look at first. She kept walking, head down, eyes on the ruts, in the frozen mud. Roads bad past the hollow. The voice came from above her, low and even, like someone commenting on the weather with no particular stake in it. She looked up. The man on the wagon seat was big, not in the showy way of men who wanted you to notice, but in the way of someone built for weather and work and not much else. He wore a canvas coat, dark with wear, and a wide-brimmed hat that shed the snow off the front brim in a thin stream. He had a beard that needed no introduction and hands on the reins that looked like they'd been carved from the same wood as the seat. He wasn't looking at her the way the men outside the hardware store had. He was just looking. "I'm not past the hollow," she said. "I'm going to the boarding house." He nodded once, like that was a reasonable thing. "Harwick's, yes." There was a pause. The horse shifted. The man said, "I heard she's full up." Wynn stopped walking. She turned to look at him fully for the first time. He wasn't saying it meanly. He wasn't saying it to wound her or to get anything out of her. He said it the same way he'd said the road was bad, like a thing that was true and might be useful to know. "Where'd you hear that?" she said. "Deakins said she'd taken in a family from down the valley. Needed the rooms." Of course Deakins had known, and he'd let her walk out anyway. She looked down the street. She looked at the sky. She did a quiet accounting of her options, and the accounting came up short. "I have somewhere else to go," she said. She didn't. The man on the wagon didn't say anything. He just sat there with the reins loose in his hands and the snow coming down between them, and he let the silence do what silence does. After a moment he said, "I'm going up the North Road, if you want the ride." "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "I don't know where you're going, up the mountain." Got a place about 4 miles past the claim marker. She looked at the road stretching east. She looked at her boots. The left one was already wet through, and she could feel the cold working up her ankle like a slow fire going the wrong direction. "What's your name?" she said. "Cass, not Mr. Anything, just the one word." She looked at him a moment longer. He didn't fidget, didn't try to persuade her, just sat there like a man who'd made an offer and was equally prepared for it to be refused. She walked around to the far side of the wagon and climbed up. He didn't help her, but he held the wagon still while she got herself situated, which was its own kind of courtesy. They rode out of town without speaking. The North Road was exactly as bad as he'd said. The ruts were deep and frozen in crooked angles, and the wagon rocked and jolted over them in a way that made her grip the seat with both hands. The pines closed in on either side after the first mile, and the snow came heavier through the gaps in the canopy fine as powder, settling on the backs of the horses and on Wynn's lap and on the brim of Cass's hat. She watched the horses. 2 of them, a matched pair, bay with black points, thick through the chest, well kept. That told her something. A man who kept his horses well was a man who understood what depended on them. She thought about what else she knew. Not much. Ted Bundy was charming. Her mother had told her once, after a neighbor's girl had gotten herself into trouble, trusting the wrong man. Wynn had been 12. She hadn't understood it then the way she understood it now. But Cass had not tried to charm her, had barely tried to talk to her, had made no promises and asked no questions. He'd just said there was a road and he was going up it. She was 26 years old, she had 43 cents, and the temperature was going to drop another 10 degrees by nightfall. She stayed on the wagon. At the 2nd mile, he reached behind the seat without looking and pulled out a heavy wool blanket, folded square, and set it on the seat between them. He didn't offer it, didn't say anything, just put it there. She unfolded it and put it over her lap and didn't say thank you right away. She said it about a minute later, quietly, to the middle distance. He said, They rode another mile before she said, "You live alone up there?" "Yes." "Since when?" He thought about it. She absorbed that. "You come into town often?" "Supply runs, every few weeks." She nodded. "And you just—" She stopped, tried again. "Why'd you offer the ride?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "You were going to walk somewhere you didn't have to go to." She turned to look at him. He was watching the road. "You could see that," she said. "A person standing outside in a coat with no buttons deciding which way to walk," he said. "You weren't in a hurry. You were deciding." She looked at her hands in her lap. He wasn't wrong. "I would have figured something out," she said. "Maybe," he said. The maybe was honest. She appreciated that more than she expected to. The cabin sat in a clearing off the east side of the road, set back into the tree line. It was not grand. It was not charming. It was a squared log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch and a woodpile. Stacked 8 feet high against the south wall. The stack of a man who had done this long enough to know what winter asked of you. Cass pulled the wagon up to the barn first. He set the brake, climbed down, and started unhitching the horses with the practiced quiet of someone who had done it 10,000 times. He unlooped the traces and checked each horse's legs before walking them into the barn, and then he came back for the supply bags from the wagon bed, 4 of them, heavy, and he carried them 2 at a time without fuss. All of it before he went inside. Wynn had climbed down from the wagon and stood in the clearing, not sure what was expected of her. "Door's not locked," he said on his 2nd pass. She went to the porch and pushed the door open. It was dark inside and cold, but out of the wind, and that alone felt like something. She could see the fireplace, stone, wide, with a good deep firebox and a proper grate. Firewood was stacked by the wall to the left of it. A cast-iron stove occupied the corner near the window. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf of provisions along the north wall, organized and not sparse. She stood in the middle of the room and let her eyes adjust. There was a ladder to a loft. 1 cot along the east wall, a rag rug on the floor that had seen better years but was clean. A pair of snowshoes hanging by the door. She was still looking at the snowshoes when he came in. He set the last 2 bags on the table, glanced at her standing there with her coat, still done up in her fist, and went to the fireplace. He built the fire from memory. Tinder first, then kindling laid in a careful cross, then 2 larger splits on top. He lit it with a single match and didn't hover over it. It caught the way a fire does when the wood is dry and the drawer is clean. He hung his coat on the peg by the door and turned to the stove. "You can put your coat on that peg," he said, without looking. She did. "Boots are wet," he said. She looked down. There was a dark patch spreading from her left boot onto the rug. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry. Just take them off. Put them near the fire." She took them off. Her left sock was soaked through and cold, in a way that had stopped feeling like cold and started feeling like nothing, which was worse. She pulled it off and stood on the rug with one bare foot and one wool-socked foot, and felt profoundly, comprehensively ridiculous. He was already at the stove. He had a heavy iron pan on the burner and was cutting slices of salt pork from a slab in one of the supply bags. The sound of it hitting the hot iron was loud in the quiet cabin, a sharp, definite sound that meant heat and food and something on the other side of the cold. "Sit," he said. There were only 2 chairs. She took the one closer to the fire. Her feet began to hurt, not the cold hurting from outside, the other kind, the coming back to life kind. The pins and needles that work their way up from the toes in hot little pulses that make you want to cry and stamp your feet at the same time. She pressed her lips together and held very still. "That'll pass," he said, from across the room. She looked up. He hadn't turned around. "I know," she said. "Takes about 10 minutes. I know," she said, a little firmer. He said nothing else. He just let it be. He made supper out of what he'd bought in town. Salt, pork, and tinned beans and corn bread from a pan that came out denser than anything she'd had in recent memory, and better than most things she could currently think of. He set the plate in front of her without ceremony and sat down across the table with his own. They ate mostly without talking. Outside, the wind had come up properly now. She could hear it moving through the pines, that long groaning sound, and she was very aware of how different it felt to hear it from. Inside, with a fire burning at her back, after a while she said, "I can't pay for this." He looked up from his plate. "I mean, not tonight, and maybe not for some time." She kept her eyes on the table. "I just want you to know I understand the situation. I didn't think this was something for nothing." He was quiet. "I'm not asking you to pay," he said. "I know. I want to say it plainly. I don't have means right now. I'm not in a position to offer much." He set his fork down. He looked at her with the same steady, unhurried look he'd had on the wagon seat when she'd asked his name. "What are you saying?" he said. She met his eyes. "I don't know what's expected of me here. I'd rather know plainly than guess wrong." He picked up his fork again. "Nothing's expected," he said. "You were cold. There's food and a fire. That's the whole of it." She watched him for a long moment. He didn't look away, but he didn't press her either. "All right," she said finally. "All right," he said. They finished eating. She washed the plates. He didn't ask her to. She just did it, because it was something to do with her hands, and because it seemed like the right shape of a thing. He dried them and put them back on the shelf in the right places, and the whole small operation took less than 10 minutes and said more about the arrangement than any conversation had. He was a tidy man. She'd noticed it when she came in. The woodpile squared up, the provisions organized, the floor swept clean. Not the tidiness of someone performing for company, but the tidiness of a person who lived alone and had worked out a system that kept the chaos at a distance. She understood that. She had her own systems. They'd just been dismantled lately. "The cot's yours," he said, when the plates were done. "Where do you sleep?" He tilted his head toward the loft. "I can take the loft," she said. "The ladder's steep. Better to start from the ground and work up." She wasn't sure what that meant, exactly. Start from the ground. It had the sound of something that applied beyond the sleeping arrangements. but he said it so plainly that she couldn't tell if he meant more by it or nothing at all. "Okay," she said. He banked the fire. Not too low, not burning hot, just the right lay to keep the room through the night without eating through the wood, and climbed the ladder without further ceremony. She lay on the cot with her coat over the wool blanket he'd left folded at the foot of it, and listened to the wind and the creak of the logs and the even sound of the fire settling. She had 43 cents. She had no room at Harwick's. She had no job, no references that would matter, and a coat that wasn't keeping her warm anymore. She had, at this exact moment, a cot by a fire and boots drying on the hearth, and a man upstairs who had not asked a single thing of her. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She lay awake for a long time, turning it over. She was up before light. Old habit. She'd worked the early shift at the survey office, and her body hadn't let go of it yet. She built the fire up from the banked coals, quietly, trying to remember what she'd watched him do. Tinder, kindling laid in a cross, a larger split on top. It took her 2 tries, but it caught. She found the coffee tin on the shelf, found the pot, worked out the stove. By the time she heard him on the ladder, there was coffee on, and she'd found hardtack in the supply bag and was trying to work out whether there were eggs anywhere. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder and looked at the stove. "I hope that's all right," she said. He walked to the shelf, took down 2 mugs, and set them on the table. "There are eggs," he said, "behind the barn. 4 hens. Probably 2 or 3 this morning if the cold didn't stop them." She put her boots on, dry now, mostly, and went out. The cold was sharp and still in the blue dark before dawn. The barn was close, warm and animals smelling inside, and she found the hens exactly where he'd said. 3 eggs, still warm. She carried them inside in the hem of her shirt. He was standing at the stove when she got back. He'd added something to the pan, dried onion maybe, or some kind of herb from a paper packet. He took the eggs from her without fuss and cracked them into the pan. And they ate breakfast at the table in the early grey light coming in from the east window. She thought about Kamloops, about the office job she'd had there before Croft, before the series of small wrong turns that had landed her on a wagon seat with a stranger going up a mountain. She thought about what her mother would say. Her mother would say she was foolish. Her mother would also say that there was something to be said for a man who checked his horse's legs before he went inside, and who put the eggs in the pan like it was nothing, and who built a fire so well that the room was still warm in the morning. Her mother had complicated opinions. "I can work," Wynn said. Cass looked up from his plate. "I mean, I can work for the room and the food. I'm not expecting something for nothing." She'd said it the night before. She knew, but it needed saying again in the daylight when things were clearer and the terms felt more real. "I can cook. I can mend. I can do accounts if you have any. I worked in an office for 2 years." He considered this. "Wood's nearly split out back," he said, "and the barn roof needs rechinking before the heavy snow. I can't do both at once." She looked at him. "I can chink a barn roof." He raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "I grew up on a quarter section in the Peace River country," she said. "I'm not fragile." He nodded, slowly. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. It was the same words as the night before. Same shape, different weight. The days fell into a pattern. She learned the shape of his mornings. Coffee first, then the animals, then the work of the day. He didn't talk much, but he wasn't silent, the way some people are silent, heavy and pointed and waiting for you to notice. His silence was the silence of a person, with no need to fill air, which was, she was finding, a very different thing. She chinkings the south wall of the barn on the 3rd day, working with a trowel and a bucket of mortar he'd mixed, standing on a crate to reach the high gaps. She could hear him splitting wood on the far side of the yard, the regular thud of the axe, and the sound of it was so steady and reliable that she found herself working in rhythm to it, without meaning to. She thought about the boarding house, about Mrs. Harwick's taken rooms and Deacon's tab. She thought, Things had worked out before. They just hadn't worked out in a way she'd been able to predict or control. They never did. You worked with what was there. On the 5th day it snowed hard, a serious snow that came in off the mountains and closed down the world outside to a grey-white wall, and they spent the day inside. He repaired a piece of tack by the fire. She mended a tear in his canvas coat, a long rip along the left arm seam that he'd been ignoring for what looked like months. When she finished and handed it back to him, he turned it over and looked at the seam and then looked at her. "Good work," he said. 2 words. She filed them away. She read that evening from a slim volume she'd found on the shelf near the provisions. A book of surveying principles, of all things, which she recognized from her time at the office, and which she read with the specific pleasure of a person finding a familiar face in an unfamiliar place. "You read surveys," he said from across the room. "I worked for one. 2 years. She turned a page. "I'm better at the math than I let on to Croft." "Why'd you let on less?" She considered. "Men like Croft don't keep women who are better at the math than they are." He said nothing to that for a moment. Then, "That's a stupid reason to leave money on the table." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." He went back to the tack. She went back to the book. On the 9th day she found herself in town again. Not by intention. He'd needed to return a borrowed tool to the smithy in town and she'd asked to come along. She had her own errand. She needed to send a letter to her sister in Calgary, who didn't know where Wynn was and had likely been worrying. He drove, and she wrote the letter in her head along the way, working out what to say and what to leave out. "I am staying on the mountain with a man named Cass. He has a cabin and a barn and 4 hens and very little to say, and I am better off than I was 9 days ago, which I will explain more fully when I understand it better myself." She did not say this. She would write something calmer and less true. In town, she stood outside the post office after she'd left her letter and watched the street. A woman, from Harwick's boarding house, came out of the dry goods store across the way and stopped when she saw Wynn. Mrs. Fenton, who'd had the room above Wynn's, looked at her the way people look when they're arranging their face for pity and curiosity at the same time. "Wynn," she said, "we wondered what happened to you. When your trunk wasn't on the porch." "I found somewhere," Wynn said. Mrs. Fenton waited for more. Wynn didn't give it. "Well," Mrs. Fenton said, "I'm glad you're all right." The way she said it made it a question. "I am," Wynn said. "Thank you." She walked back to the wagon. Cass was already there. He'd tied the horses to the post and was checking the offside horse's left hind hoof. He'd noticed it, favoring that leg on the way in, a stone caught in the frog, which he dug out with his knife in about 30 seconds of efficient work. He set the hoof down and looked up. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." He didn't ask who the woman was. He didn't ask what had been said. He just climbed up and gathered the reins and waited for her to get situated, and then they drove back up the north road in the early afternoon light, and the town fell away behind them. She thought about Mrs. Fenton's face, about the question in "I'm glad you're all right." She was all right. She was more than all right, and she hadn't quite let herself say so yet, because she'd been fooled by better than nothing before, and she was cautious with good things now, in a way she hadn't needed to be when she was younger. But she was all right. It was 3 weeks in when she found the account ledger. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for a pencil on the shelf by the window, and the book had slid out from behind a coffee tin, fat, with loose receipts stuffed between the pages. She'd opened it out of reflex. Reflow, the same reflex that had made her good at the survey office, and she'd seen what she expected to see. Uneven columns additions carried wrong, 2 or 3 errors that were compounding themselves quietly through the pages in a way that would eventually matter. She left it on the table with a pencil beside it. That evening, Cass sat down after supper and opened it without preamble, the way she'd suspected he would. Not because she'd left it there as a suggestion, but because he was a man who noticed things and drew his own conclusions. He spent 20 minutes on it. She washed up, She could hear the occasional scratch of the pencil. "Found 3 mistakes," he said when she came back to the table. "4, she said. "There's one in October you didn't get to yet." He turned the pages back. "Found it. He said. "I can do those," she said, "if you want. Going forward." He closed the book. He looked at her for a moment, with that same steady, undemanding look. "What would you want for it?" he said. "Not you don't have to, or I can manage." He just asked, straight, what the terms were. She thought about it honestly. "A fair winter," she said. "Somewhere to be until spring. Then we see." He nodded. "Then we see," he agreed. The morning she found the wolf prints at the tree line was the morning she understood something about this place that she hadn't quite had words for before. She'd gone out early to collect the eggs, as she did, and she'd come around the corner of the barn and stopped because the tracks were right there in the new snow, large and deep, and heading toward the chicken yard before veering away into the trees. Her heart had done something quick and unpleasant. She'd stood very still for a moment, looking at the size of them. Then she'd gone back inside and told Cass. He'd put on his coat without hurrying. Not because he wasn't concerned, but because hurrying wouldn't change what was already in the trees. And he'd come out and looked at the prints and checked the yard and checked the hens, who were all fine and annoyed about it. And then he'd spent the rest of the morning building the fence line up another 2 feet on the east side where the tracks came closest. Shents. She'd helped. She'd held the posts while he drove them. At noon, when they came inside for coffee, she said, "Does that happen often?" "Often enough," he said. "More in a hard winter. Does it worry you?" He looked out the window toward the tree line. "You manage what you can," he said. "The rest you leave in the trees." She thought about that for a long time. You manage what you can. The rest you leave in the trees. She'd been trying to manage the rest for 2 years. The job, the room, the 43 cents, the coat with no buttons. And it had been wearing her down, in a specific accumulating way she hadn't let herself name until right now, in this cabin, looking at a man who had built up a fence line and made coffee and let the wolves be wolves. "That's useful," she said. "What is, what you just said?" He looked at her, a little uncertain. "About the trees," she said. He considered this. "It's just how it is," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what makes it useful." The snow came in earnest in the 3rd week of November, and kept coming. The road to town was impassable for 11 days. She didn't mind the way she thought she would. There was enough to do. The animals, the wood, the cooking, the accounts, a second tier she found in the curtain at the east window and repaired without being asked. The days had shape. She had not had days with shape in longer than she wanted to admit. She learned his rhythms, the way you learn the rhythms of a particular place. Not by being told, but by being there long enough that they become your own. He was worse in the morning than the afternoon, not just quieter, more internal, working something out. By midday he loosened up. By evening he could be made to talk, not easily, but genuinely, in the way of someone who had something to say and had just been waiting to be asked the right thing. She started asking. Not pressing, just asking. Small things. How'd you learn to re-chink the mortar that way? Where'd the horses come from? What's the name of that peak to the northwest? He answered. Slowly, then not so slowly. She learned the horses were bred in the caribou, and he'd had them 4 years. The peak to the northwest was called Shepherd's Tooth by the locals, though no map she'd seen called it that. He'd learned the mortar from an old man in the Peace River country who'd charged him a day's work for the lesson, which was, Cass said, a fair price. "I grew up in the Peace," she said, surprised. He looked at her. "Whereabouts?" she told him. He knew the area. He'd been through it twice, once in summer and once in winter, and he described it well enough that she felt something shift in her chest, the particular ache of being understood by geography, when words weren't quite doing it. "Small world," she said. "Not small," he said. "Just some paths cross more than once." She thought about that at night. About paths crossing. The road opened in early December, and he drove down for supplies on a Thursday. She didn't go this time. She had bread rising and didn't want to leave it, and she also wasn't sure she wanted to see Mrs. Fenton's face again, the question in it. He was back by mid-afternoon. He came in with the supply bags and set them on the table, and at the bottom of the last one was a small paper parcel that he set aside separately. He put the provisions away in the right places, in the order she'd come to expect, and when he was done, he picked up the parcel and held it out. She took it. Inside was a skein of dark green wool, the color of spruce trees in January. She looked up. "For the coat," he said. "That button wool you've been using doesn't match right. And the lining." He stopped. Started again. "There's enough there." She held the wool in her hands. It was good wool, not the cheapest. He'd had to think about it, go looking for it, carry it home. She didn't say you didn't have to. It would have been wrong. She said, "Thank you, Cass." He nodded once and hung up his coat. February came in grey and still. She'd been there 3 months, which she hadn't quite meant to count until she found herself counting. 3 months was not 3 weeks. 3 months was a different kind of thing. She was mending a pair of his work gloves one evening. The right thumb had worn through, which happened first on a man who used his right hand the way he used a tool when he came in from the barn and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her sitting by the fire with his gloves in her lap. "Road'll be passable in 6 weeks, he said. She looked up. "Probably," she agreed. He came in and hung up his coat. He poured a mug of coffee and sat down across from her. He turned the mug in his hands. "You could go back to town," he said. "Or south. There's good work in Kamloops in the spring. I could." He stopped. "I know someone at the land office in town. Decent man. He'd give you a fair chance if I spoke for you." She looked at the gloves in her hands. "Is that what you want?" she said. He was quiet. "I want what's useful for you," he said carefully. "That's not what I asked." He looked at the fire. "No," he said. "It's not." The fire popped. Outside, the wind was low tonight, just a murmur. She folded the gloves together and set them on the table. "I can go," she said, "if that's the shape of things. You've been more than fair to me, and I'm not looking to be a burden past my welcome." "You're not a burden," he said. Flat, immediate, the flattest, most immediate he'd said in 3 months. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire again, the muscle in his jaw working slightly. "I built the fence up on the east side," he said, eventually. She waited. "Takes 2 people to do it right," he said. "One to hold, one to drive." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that your case?" she said. "Part of it," he said. She nodded. She picked the gloves back up. She found the needle where she'd left it. "Then we see," she said. He looked at her. "Then we see," he said. Outside, the last of the February wind moved through the pines. That long, old sound. And inside the fire burned clear and even, and the gloves got mended, and the coffee went cold, and neither of them moved to get up.